Razorfen Kraul, the nest of huge twisting vines and narrow, treacherous paths the Quillbore of the Southern Barrens call home. I'm Shupsy, and today in Warcraft Space and Story, we're going to see how lore and game design come together to tackle one of the biggest challenges in fantasy storytelling, the dawn of a new culture. The level range of Razorfen Kraul is actually quite interesting, especially in relation to where it is. So before the split into two zones, the Barrens had a massive level range from around 7 all the way to level 30. So even if you left at level 20 to go to Ashenvale, that's still over 10 levels in one zone. But let's say you stuck it out from start to finish and finally pushed on to Thousand Needles. The way you'd leave the Barrens is down this very path where the Razorfen dungeons on either side of you essentially promised you'd be back, and back soon. For those of you who've never played a Horde character in early WoW, that's just a small part of the reason why this zone is etched so deeply into the minds of many players. The key to understanding pretty much everything about the lore in Razorfen Kraul revolves around these vines. They're said to have sprouted from where the boar wild god Agamagan, the progenitor of the Quillbore, bled in his fight against the Pit Lord Manaroth in the War of the Ancients 10,000 years ago. The concentration of them in this part of the Barrens lets us guess this is also where he died. Although being by all accounts the youngest and both physically and magically weakest pre-Horde faction trying to survive in the Barrens, it's interesting to note that the Quillbore also seemed to hold the most territory within it. Which makes sense given the natural defences offered by their homes. Think of the thorns like caves were to early humanity, a natural feature that offered protection and eventually became ingrained into the culture. The second we step into the dungeon, we see some evidence for that link with these tusk paintings on the wall. For all my talk of defensibility, it's surprising to see that the first Quillbore in Razorfen Kraul are dead, impaled by massive Tauren weapons. But that wasn't always the case. Although Razorfen Kraul stayed mostly the same through the massive Cataclysm overhaul, it was redesigned quite extensively in Warlords of Draenor to fit in with the Mankrik and Old Stonespire storylines, both being characters on a sort of lone wolf vengeance mission against the Quillbore. The changes for the most part focused on making the place visually and mechanically more engaging, such as these tripwires that spawn mobs, rather than the Cataclysm model of telling entirely new storylines in old spaces. The use of animal traps does feed into a rather interesting dynamic though. As I alluded to in the introduction, Quillbore society still seems to be in its earliest stages of development, driven mostly by hunter-gathering and basic mysticism. But at the same time, you find many of them wearing suits of scale armour and wielding advanced weapons, which they presumably stole from the Horde, given that they don't seem to have forges or smithies that we know of. The first boss of the dungeon is Kraul Shaper Tukar. The Kraul Shapers are interesting because they're using fundamentally druidic magic, focused around the natural aspects of their environment, kinda like the hedge wizards in Gilneas prior to the Worgen Curse. You can think of it like this. They are druids who only know entangling roots, but they're so good at it, they've made it effectively its own offshoot school of magic. As to Tukar here, we don't really know much. She's a new addition to the dungeon and thus far lacks a dungeon journal entry. Another interesting thing we see about Quillbore society in Razorfen Kraul is their relationship with boars, who they see as incarnations of Agamagan. No other animal wild god derived species seems to have those views. Furbolg/Pandaren don't seem to have any particular focus on bears, and cows can't even be found on the same continent as Tauren. Damn it, I can't just let that joke sit. Tauren are technically descended from the Yongol, who are yaks, which are found both in Pandaria, but even then, the yaks don't feature all that heavily in Yongol culture. The general sense of movement throughout Razorfen Kraul is a slow, winding ascent. There's certainly dips and plateaus every so often, but most of the dungeon is spent working our way upwards, towards the roof of thorns and open sky above. In many cultures of our early history, priests and holy men lived in high buildings to communicate with the gods above. And here we can see effectively the same thing. Being closer to the living blood of Agamagan, the vines of the Kraul, means you're more important. And here our path forward is blocked, so we're forced to go down the sides in an attempt to open the way. What I think is cool is that because our view of the path was blocked as we made our way up, we don't know what to expect until we commit to one or the other. So first we'll go down the left, where we see young hunters learning the skills that provide food and safety for their people. Overseeing their training at the end of the path is pack leader Bone Tusk. While hanging out in a sty doesn't seem that prestigious for the master hunter from our perspective, it does make pulling and fighting him quite difficult, and in terms of the lore, it's an honour that he gets to train the next generation of Agamagan's children. As both bosses need to be killed before the gate goes down, the switching of paths here is a little bit odd, as we're forced to backtrack the whole path or drop back into the lower road. A bridge or vine that let us cross between sides likely would have flowed better, but neither path is very long, so it's not really a major issue. So where the left path was all about practical survival, the right is concerned with spirituality, as we see geomancers and kraul shapers practicing and teaching their craft. This contrast between the two paths uses space cleverly to really highlight the two cornerstones of Quilboar culture. The hunters provide for the mystics, and the mystics inspire and guide the hunters. At the end of the path we find Rugug, once a fairly unimportant and out-of-the-way boss, but now the overseer of the Quilboar geomancers. So like kraul shaping is essentially a spin-off of druidism, Quilboar geomancy is a lot like shamanism, but the magic is channeled through powered crystals, rather than totems like the Tauren or Orcs would use. Personally, I think this is awesome, as it gives a cultural flair to magic we're already familiar with, sort of like the racial priest spells that were originally in the game. With the gate now open, we can continue onward and upward, but the second we actually pass where the gate was, our attention is immediately drawn by the magical bonfire only a little bit down the path. Before we get there though, we have this interesting war painting, showing a pair of Quilboar hunters fighting Centaur, with what appears to be a magic user of some kind leading them. I think it's interesting to note the weapons of the Centaur figures. We've never seen Centaur use pitchforks or tridents before, so it's strange to see them here, but of course those weapons have a connotation with us, the players, of the devil and evil in general. So through this painting we get a sense of how the Quilboar view themselves, and at least one of their many enemies in the Barrens. Now in regards to the big swirly circle, in it we see Warlord Ramtusk and two spirits of former bosses, Ugam Thorncurse and Deathspeaker Jagbar. The dungeon journal states that Ramtusk is an old Quilboar who's taken to communing with these former spiritual leaders and seeking their help. It's not surprising that the Quilboar have a military commander of very high station in their society, but what is interesting is the magic he's using. In the original version of RFK, there were many mobs tagged as part of the Death's Head cult, which preached the return of Agamagan, and they tended to use shadow or spirit magic. They've since been replaced by the Geomancers as the primary form of Quilboar magic and mysticism, but obviously Ramtusk here is a traditionalist. The Death's Head is quite interesting, as yet another wrinkle and potential path in Quilboar society to develop and advance around, but they have more to do with the other Razorfen dungeon, Razorfen Downs, so we'll leave them there for now. A short path leads us to this series of vine bridges, where we see both a group of kraul shapers and geomancers attempt to command beings far more powerful than them, and pay for it. So obviously there's some competition between the two major schools of Quilboar magic, but it also speaks to a sort of desperation. The Horde, the Alliance, and now even the Burning Legion are all groups muscling in on what the Quilboar see as their land, and no amount of stealing weapons and armor is going to let them defend themselves properly, so they have to think bigger. This final bridge is the longest, and whereas most of the pathways in the dungeon were walled off or strategically impeded your view with vines, this one is almost completely open, and gives us a goal to work towards in that tall hut to the right. Just before that though, we have this bat-filled cave, a sudden and late shift from the mostly consistent feel of the dungeon thus far. This 11th hour shake-up provides some variety to the dungeon, but also serves to let us know that when we emerge from the cave again into the light of the kraul, whatever we find on the other side will be significant. Rounding this corner, we see something different at the end of the path. We can tell it's a massive stationary bat, but what it's doing is mostly obscured by that pillar on our right. As we get closer, we find it's Groyat the Blind Hunter, a former rare mob feeding on the carcass of a former boss, Agathelos the Raging. What's interesting, and also really gross, is that Agathelos was fed bat guano, making him incredibly powerful, but also very aggressive. And now with Groyat feeding on him, the bat's experiencing a sort of second-hand mad cow bat disease. On a more conceptual level though, it's further evidence of the failure of the quillboar to defend against external threats. With the light at the end of the tunnel now visible, we find the last pack of quillboar mobs in the dungeon, consisting of a hunter, a warrior, and a mystic, each doing something that represents their contribution to society. The geomancer is fairly obvious, while the hunter stands next to a table of meat, and the warrior patrols for dangers. Right at the exit, we see this ghostly boar, who is in fact the spirit of Agamagan himself. Usually with wild gods, if killed, they return to life later on, like Cenarius or Malorn, but Agamagan seems to be the exception. A theory for that is that much of his spirit is used up by the creation of the vines and quillboar rituals which call upon and thus sap his power. So the noble and powerful boar god has to rely on us, the heroes, to turn his children away from dark paths. The one leading them down dark paths, and also the final boss of the dungeon, is Chalga Razorflank, the crone of the Razorfen Quillboar. So Chalga is a uniquely political and opportunistic quillboar. Originally she led the Death's Head cult, but in this incarnation of the dungeon she's the most powerful geomancer of her people. In either case though, her motivation is personal power, and she's willing to use her people as tools to achieve it. It's important to note that she's not the chieftain though. Her title is crone, so returning to the idea of a prehistoric society still finding its feet, Chalga can be thought of as the wise woman or seer of the village, abusing her power and influence to take control of her people. With Razorflank dead, we close the story of Razorfen Kraul. Originally, there was a return path that made up a very, very long escort quest back to the start of the dungeon, but that's since been blocked off. Either way, we came to this space seeking vengeance, and discovered a people attempting to discover themselves. With the removal of the major players steering them astray, we've worked to give the quillboar a chance to find a better path. Unfortunately, we accomplished that through lots and lots of murder, but let's ignore that for now. Anyhow, that was the story of the space, and how the space has told the story in Razorfen Kraul. I've been Shupsy, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd just like to apologise again for the shakiness of the camera in this one. With the Legion camera changes, the add-on I was using, Camera Plus, has broken, and I haven't really been able to find a replacement to create that sort of smooth movement. If anyone knows of anything like that, I'd love to know, otherwise I'll keep practicing. If you like this video, feel free to give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you're into the game design aspect of this series, keep an eye out on the channel, because I've been working on something interesting that should hopefully come to fruition soon. Otherwise, as always, it's great to hear from you guys in the comments, and thank you. Thank you so much for your time.